This is Catherine Bassett. John, it's okay with you that we record this so that people who aren't able to join us this evening will be able to listen to it and see it after the fact?
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Well, welcome to the NSTOY policy webinar this evening, October 1st, 2013, with our special guest, John Barry. If you have signed up for this webinar, then you're very well aware of who John is. John is a retired Major General, and after his military career was completed, he decided to take his talents and share them with us in education. John served as a superintendent of schools in the state of Colorado, and now in his third career, he has started an organization for superintendents of the year, similar to NSTOY and what NSTOY is for teachers of the year. The organization is called VistaQuest, and John and I have been having a series of conversations around how we as state teachers can work with VistaQuest as state superintendents of the year to do good work for teachers and students. So we're really excited to have John with us this evening. Part of his responsibility when he was in the military was to conduct an after-action review, so to speak, an investigation of what went wrong, what went right with the Columbia space shuttle accident. And as a result of conducting that investigation, John learned a great deal about leadership. Not that he needed to learn it, he already knew a great deal, but he learned even more. And this evening he's going to share with us the lessons that he and his team learned investigating the Columbia accident, and how we can apply those lessons to education in our roles as teachers. So John, we're so pleased to have you with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about the subject. As you can see on the slide, the app before you, this is what I call when the right stuff goes wrong, but it really applies the lessons to education. But I think I'll hopefully pique your curiosity by talking about some of the technology elements of it, and then we'll get into the culture management and organization lessons learned that apply to this accident, but also apply to any major organization. Certainly, education is one of them. So let me just start out by telling you that having been in the military for 30 years, business for 3, superintendent for 7, one of the things I learned was that there are many ventures in various walks of life. In the military, believe it or not, we studied business and education to gather insights. In business, when I was there, we studied the military and education. So in education, we must open ourselves to various venues to see where we can apply the hard lessons of life to make us better at what we do. In other words, to accelerate student achievement and close the achievement gaps. So at the end of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, which I was served as the executive director, we have a patch that memorializes the 3 human spaceflight accidents. If you'll remember in history, Apollo 1 fire was a simulator that caught fire. We lost some astronauts in 1967. The Challenger mishap in 1986, and this Columbia shuttle accident in 2003. But on that report, we said to the stars, despite adversity, always explore. So we're going to talk about some stories, and we're going to talk about the significant elements of what happened on that accident. So you're going to see in front of you just a brief outline of what I'm going to cover tonight, and I'll go through some of these slides pretty quickly to give you a sense of what it was like to be on that accident. Well, first of all, there's a lot of words here, and I don't expect everybody to read it really quickly, but the bottom line is the technical cause for the accident was the phone. I'll explain what that is and where it was located and how it ended up cracking the left wing. It came off 81 seconds after flight, roughly, and it ended up hitting the left wing, which caused problems with the crack on reentry when you got all that heat. The other one that's interesting is there were organizational causes. And there's a lot of words here, but basically it says culture, management, and organization issues were evident in NASA. And it's one of those things where you have to be able to understand the significance of what I'm just going to mention here. When we said we found the causes for the accident, it shook NASA up a little bit when we mentioned the fact that we had two equal causes. One was the technical and the other one was its organizational causes. I think you'll find the technical ones kind of interesting, certainly if you're in any kind of education in science, technology or engineering and math. And then I think everyone will garner some lessons learned that we got from the second cause, which was the organizational causes, as we go along here. Well, I always want to show the slides of the astronauts. Rick Husband had flown, this was his second flight, Willie McCool, first flight. Casey Chawla, flight engineer, was her second flight. Walt Clark was her first, David Brown's first, Mike Anderson second, and we had an Israeli astronaut on board. Now it's interesting, just on a side note, Ilya Ramon happened to be in the F-16 attack in 1981 on the Baghdad reactor. Now this is 2003, of course. 1981 was quite a few years before that, but he was an F-16 fighter pilot that was on that mission. So, you know, you can imagine that our first concerns was their sabotage. I'll just clear that up right away. We definitely concluded there was no terrorist or sabotage elements that were involved in this, and I can hopefully convince you that the thorough investigation we did allowed us to arrive at a conclusion rather significantly. But these were great units who did their job and lost their lives, so we always want to be able to honor their memory in discussing anything for an accident. Not only did it affect them, clearly affected their families and all the residual elements and people that were in NASA at the time. So let me just mention a couple of things. This is a little bit about Shuttle 101. This was the 113th mission in the Space Shuttle. Now the first flight was Columbia, this shuttle, and it was in 1981. So this is 2003. So this is, 22 years later. It was supposed to fly. About 100 missions in the course of 10 years. That's 10 missions a year. Well, it didn't quite get there because this was only the 28th mission for Columbia, and it was the oldest one. So it was January 16th, if some of you remember, back in 2003, and there was a 16-day science mission. It was not a mission to the space station. It was a mission, however, to an orbiting around the planet with the space science module in the back of the shuttle. And I'll explain a couple of things why that was significant. In our course of review and investigation, I can tell you that we looked at aerodynamic, thermodynamic, timelines, imagery, debris evidence, all pointed in one direction, and that was that the technical cause of the accident was the phone. I'm going to show you a brief video here, and as it comes up. Now this is the shuttle launching on a pad at Cape Canaveral, of course, at the Kennedy Space Station. I hope it's going to come out clearer than that. We'll give it some time. But the shuttle is going right now. It's at 700 to 800 knots, 1.2 Mach. That's 1.2 times the speed of sound. We're going to zone in on the bipod here on the left connecting rod. That was the piece that came off. And you're going to see briefly that it's going to hit there. See the gray colored of the left wing there? And that little green patch? Well, it's not painted green. It's just highlighted for demonstration purposes. But that's where the foam is going to hit. It comes off, and you can see it in the air now as it starts moving. It breaks into three pieces, and the largest piece hits it. And it hits it about 500, you can look at the airspeed right now, is 1,500 miles an hour. That's about 500 foot-pounds of pressure. So even though it's only 1.2 pounds of foam, which people find hard to believe that foam could crack anything, but if you're going that fast and you hit it, it is going to cause some serious damage. And it did, in fact, crack that left wing. It didn't cause problems on launch because you're going up to less and less atmosphere, less and less molecules hitting the left wing. And when you get up there, they didn't even know they had a problem, and I'll explain some of that too. Bottom line is, they jettison the solid rocket motors 2 minutes after flight, and this is sped up now, but the external tank, once they roll, they jettison the external tank, and that is in fact what carries the liquid fuel. So effectively, this vehicle now is a glider. It does not have any more fuel except for some retro rockets, and it is in orbit for 16 days as we go along. But remember, this happened, this foam came off 81 seconds after flight. Well, here's a launch sequence. You can see here the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's the sequence of launch. The arrow is pointed between 4 and 5. That's when the foam came off. Now, I'll go back to the culprit again. The culprit is at one of the 4 junction connections to the external tank. This big orange tank is the liquid fuel of hydrogen and oxygen, super cooled to minus 400 degrees for hydrogen and minus 180 or so for oxygen. Now, you know what happens to the thermos bottle when you take a shower, the condensation from the water. Well, the problem with the external tank, you can see it's higher than the nose of the shuttle. Now, if any of that had ice that was formed on top of the orange external tank, and that came down and hit the shuttle, it could damage it. So they covered the entire external tank with foam. So that orange that you see around the tank is all foam. Well, the connection, we call it the bipod, is one of the junctions. You can see over in the picture on the right, there's 2 junctions that connect this shuttle to the external tank, and there's 2 on the bottom, and that's it. That's all that connects it. And underneath that foam, you can see on the bottom picture is what it looks like. But the intent is to prevent ice from forming and be able to go ahead and have this shuttle launch safely. Well, unfortunately, the item that was supposed to protect the shuttle, the foam, ended up being the culprit. So where did it hit? The leading edge of the shuttle is made up of 23 separate, what we call RCC panels, reinforced carbon-carbon. And one of the unique things about this, it may look like it's thick in the bottom right picture, but in truth, the fact, it's only 1/4 of an inch thick. Now, let me say that again. It's only 1/4 of an inch thick because it doesn't burn off. It re-radiates the heat. It's an incredible technology. Do you remember in the Apollo 13 movie, if you saw that, the capsule coming in and the bottom of it's on fire? Well, it's very hot on reentry, about 10 to 20,000 degrees, depending on where you are. And it burns it off. Well, we don't have anything that burns off in the shuttle. What it does is it re-radiates the heat. Interestingly enough, I saw a piece of panel that was put in what you might recognize as a microwave, but it was a much different microwave because it went to 10,000 degrees. But they put a piece of the RCC, reinforced carbon-carbon, inside this microwave. They turned it on to 10,000 degrees. And the technician, once it was up there, he turned off the heat, opened the door, and put his hand on the panel. That's how quickly it re-radiated the heat. And it can't be more than 1/4 of an inch thick because it won't re-radiate the heat well enough. And if it's any thinner than it, of course, you've got structural issues. So it is not a very thick part of the shuttle, and clearly one that would be vulnerable to any strikes. Well, it hit around that panel number 9 that you see on this diagram. It broke through the wall. And I'm going to tell you a story about this MADS recorder. Do you see this recorder down on the right? That, in fact, is a reel-to-reel, honest to goodness. This is 1981 technology in 2003, but they still had reel-to-reel. And believe it or not, we were able to recover that reel-to-reel all but 1/4 of an inch of the tape. And it was an amazing story. So maybe I'll have time to explain a little bit about that. But you got to remember that this was a shuttle that was flown first time in 1981. All right, I'm going to show you a video now of the entry. Now, they've been in space for 16 days. They were told that the piece of foam did come off because some of the cameras did see it. The challenge was that the technician who analyzed it at the time was using an algorithm called Crater that was designed in 1976. He was trained on it in a webinar, if you want to think of it that way, en route from California to Texas. And he was a young guy, and that's who ended up making an analysis that the piece of foam that they saw come off on the camera the day after the launch on January 17th was not a factor, and it didn't hurt the shuttle, when in fact it truly did. Well, 16 days in space, they're at the end of it. They've had a real successful mission. The science module in the back, remember this was not to the space station, this was just a science module. Of course, when you put the science module on the back of the shuttle, you don't have an arm that you might have seen before. And anyway, this is what happened on the day of reentry. Now we're back on February 1st, 16 days later, and this is what you'll see. Now this is going to be a little kind of staggered here too. But the shuttle actually flies upside down and backwards. And the reason it flies upside down is to stay away from the sun. And the reason it flies backwards is if they ever hit any little small meteorites, it's going to hit the back engine. Well, of course, the back engine is not functional anymore because there's no fuel. It's better to hit the back than to hit the front where the crew is in case it cracks somewhere, some piece of the windshield. And now it's making a reentry. It's 740,000 feet high. Mach is 16,000. The airspeed is 16,000 miles an hour. That's a Mach of 20 plus the speed of sound. It's using a retro rockets to position itself. Now, for demonstration purposes, we had a cutaway. Now, this is just for demonstration on the left wing. And you see all that green? Those are all sensors. There's no black box on the space shuttle. It has a bunch of sensors, and you can see over in the left wing there's a little bit of heat now being generated because the crack is being eaten away by the heat. And that's what's got a funny color scheme. If you look at the top right, green is good and blue is bad. So all the sensors right now are reading green, but they're soon to change colors here as the shuttle makes its reentry. So it's coming in at about a 40 degrees angle of attack, nose up, and it rolls to the right. Now this is programmed, it's part of the autopilot, it's fully expected because you think of it slicing through the atmosphere. And it wants to be able to come at a right angle so it doesn't get too steep or too hot, and it doesn't want to go too shallow because it could actually bounce off the atmosphere and go back into space. So it's cutting through the atmosphere. It's over the Pacific Ocean. You see it coming up on California. It's early in the morning on Saturday, February 1st. Some of you will remember that day. Now, as it slices through the atmosphere, that heat is starting to eat away at that wing. Now, the crew doesn't know it, and none of the sensors that were able to record a problem were being sent to the cockpit, nor were they being transmitted down to Johnson Space Center. So really, the crew does not know that there's anything wrong. But you can see some of them are popping different colors and not green anymore. As they approach the coastline of California, there's actually amateur photographers north and south of that trajectory, and they just get up early in the morning and then I'll show you maybe some of that video if we have time. So you're going to start seeing the bottom left corner, first debris leaving over, second debris. The reason we know that is from the amateur photographers. We don't know it from the crew or any sensors. But the heat is starting to get over there in the left wheel well. And it pops through the top of the wing there, that white splash that you just saw. And you'll see the sun and the moon actually rising, but it's over Arizona, coming over Arizona, heading towards Texas. Now you're going to see it roll here in just a minute to the left, and that's a normal thing because it has a little bit of a tendency to veer off on a yaw angle. So it's veering off a little bit to the right, so they want to correct back to the left. So here in just a few minutes, in just a few seconds, you'll see the retro rockets fire, and it actually roll to the left. Well, that heat now is deeply embedded inside of the wing, and as it's doing that, it's 10,000 degrees plus and eating out away the structure of the wing. There's no explosion because there's no atmosphere up there. So here's the shuttle as it rolls to the left. And right now, the crew is still on autopilot. They're having conversations that everything's going all right. About this time, Kennedy Space Center and Johnson Space Center see an anomaly in the sensor that is transmitted down to the ground from the left wheel well. And they say and report to the commander that we're reading a hot in the left wheel well. And that's acknowledged by the commander, and that's the last communication they have. We lose the shuttle on the hour. On the bottom, you can see the seconds. Right now it's 13:58 at 1400. That's Zulu time or time in England. Now you see those sketches on the ground there. Those are just artificially put there, but that's the debris pattern when the shuttle breaks up, where it starts scattering all over the place. And I'll show you in just a minute what that looks like. Of course, we lost the shuttle on February 1st, and it broke up right about 9 o'clock East Coast time as it goes along here. Well, here's another sketch. The shuttle at the very beginning when it's over Australia. This is what it looked like. All the sensors were green. Everything's normal. This is 44 minutes past the hour. We lose the shuttle on the hour. And then on February 1st, this heat starts getting in through the first layer of the leading edge, and then it gets into the second layer and starts eating away at the wing. Wings are pretty empty. In fact, you and I could walk in there. If you're average height, you'll be scooped down a little bit, but you can actually walk inside the wing. There's that much space. There's no fuel in there. The fuel is all on the external tank and the solid rocket motor. And then it gets in the wheel well, and that was probably the time where we suspect that there was failure of the wheel well there and broke through, and that's when we started really losing it. Well, this is when she broke up. You can see where she was. She was right over Texas, and then the sensors that were there are all reading bad anomalies, and based on the video and imagery, we concluded that that's when we lost it. Remember I told you about the MADS recorder that we reel to reel? Well, we had an incredible team. For a 3-month search, we had thousands, 30,000 plus people, Boy Scouts, park rangers, covered a lot of acres, 37 helicopters. We spent a lot of money. We actually recovered about 40% of the space shuttle. Now, here is a debris pattern, and the reason this is so specific is that every single piece that we found, we recorded with a GPS. Now you can see if this had flown over Dallas, probably would have been a different story, but here's the amazing thing. Not one single piece of debris hit a car, a house, or a human, or an animal that we were aware of. It was really a gift that nobody was hurt from the debris pattern. But I was in Nacogdoches, Texas. Of course, the shuttle failed on Saturday, and on Sunday I was around with some members of the board on that first day of our investigation. Now, we'll see if this works. I want to show you this. This is interesting from the standpoint of just what these amateur photographers are able to do. You'll find it interesting that this is the shuttle there, and that other bright light is actually Mars. It just happens to be aligned perfectly. But you'll see a piece of the shuttle come off right about there. So these amateur photographers were very helpful in our ability to get there. A quick story. One guy didn't want to turn his camera in unless we paid him $250,000. So we ended up having the FBI knock on his door, and he quickly realized his stupidity. So it's always good to have resources. This is a picture from a helicopter, an infrared picture from 2 Dutch pilots who were being trained in Texas, and they just happened to look up with their sensor, and this is what they saw. It was an incredible, fearsome, and tragic picture. All right, so we got as many pieces as we could. We placed them on the ground, as a lot of accident investigations do, and you can see where the placements are. It's actually amazing that scientists and the engineers could take a piece that was maybe a quarter of an inch, and they could tell you exactly where that thing was on the shot. Well, in-depth testing, we did foam analysis, we did reinforced carbon-carbon analysis, tile, aerothermal analysis, we looked at structural elements, forensic testing. It all led us to the same conclusion, that it was this foam that did it. It wasn't an explosion in the space science lab. It wasn't a meteorite that cracked it. It wasn't sabotage. We went through all these different kinds of failure analysis. So with the aerodynamic, thermodynamic, timeline, imagery, and everything, that's the same words you saw when I showed you. The technical cause was the foam hit it, the left wing, 81 seconds after flight, and caused the failure by a crack on re-entry with the tremendous heat. And here's some other elements. You know, there was a breach, a tunnel test, temperature increases, launch imagery that we were able to put together and be able to recover that reel to reel. You know, we sent people out to find it because we really wanted to get that back, thinking that it didn't survive and burned up on re-entry because of the heat. But the engineers were convinced after they got the GPS recordings from other pieces, they could tell you exactly where it was. Well, bottom line is they couldn't find it. So the engineers sent the searchers out again and said, it's got to be right around this area. And darn it, they didn't find it. Right side up, under a bush, not damaged, I mean, to the point where the reel wasn't damaged. And we had some valuable information on that allowed us to really zone in on what the cause was. Well, that's what I talked to you about now. I talked about the technical, and now we're going to move into the culture management and organization, and why history, decision-making, organizational structures, and system effects apply. All right, so I'm going to leave this slide up for a little bit and just talk to you now about some of the issues of the organizational cause. Here's what I want you to remember. Complex systems fail in complex ways, requiring complex solutions. Now that sounds pretty intuitive, but there is no one silver bullet in any organization, and that includes education. So I'd like you to think about a couple of things. You know, we had an analysis here of a Canadian case study. It had nothing to do with flying or space or anything. It was just two brothers in Canada who were charged with chlorinating the wells in this town, and they failed to do it properly. A lot of people got sick, and 6 children died. It was a big mess in Canada. The thing that investigation team did is they did something different. Normally when you have an aircraft accident, and I've unfortunately been part of some of those investigations in the Air Force, and you find the widget that broke, you find the people closest to the widget, you fire, retire, replace them, get the lessons learned, move on. Well, we didn't do that, nor did this Canadian study do that. They examined why the brothers weren't trained, where the funding was that didn't allow them to be trained. They traced it back all the way to what we would call the Department of Interior, and then to the legislature, the Parliament, all the way back to the Prime Minister. So they looked at the whole system, and that's exactly what we did. We didn't just look at the phone that hit and get the widget, which was the phone, find the people closest to it, recommend retirement, firing, and then move on. So my question to you is that when complex systems fail in complex ways, if we fix the foam in the shuttle, it would be safe to fly. So in education, if we have reduced class size, we'll allow for accelerated student achievement by itself. Okay? Some people will say, okay, we found a silver bullet, reduce class size. But we all know that it's not that simple. Complex systems fail in complex ways, requiring complex systems. We have to have a system of systems. Now the question is, who's to blame? Well, when you have a complex system and fail in complex ways, there is no one answer. And simply changing personnel won't help in the long run. So in education, are we failing because of teachers, principals, superintendents, Board of Education? Are we failing because the system has stated in a study, if you remember a few years back, Tough Choices, Tough Times, which really attacked the system and not individual entities of it? It really took a more systemic approach to it, which I think was a little bit more reasonable. So when we start thinking about that, I want you to remember the second thing. And this is what most people remember out of this briefing. Normalizing deviance. It's a funny term. It's a term that really was started in the Challenger accident in 1986. And what it means is it really tells a story that when you see things that are wrong, a lot of times people will write it off and it's the price of doing business. Some people have used that term. In the case of NASA, foam was coming off the space shuttle on every single flight. If you remember, popcorn pieces would come off and they'd have to repair it when it landed. And pieces of foam had come off the external tank, that big orange tank. So why didn't they fix it? Unfortunately, there were 700 single points of failure on the space shuttle that could result in accidents, loss of life, loss of shuttle, or both. So they prioritized things. But obviously they didn't prioritize the right thing in trying to get you to fall. So a little bit of Russian roulette. You know, you put a gun to your head, you squeeze the trigger, nothing happens. You squeeze the trigger again, nothing happens. Well, I'm going to squeeze it a third time, nothing's going to happen. Well, not so fast. So the foam issue was normalizing deviance. So my question to you is, what kind of normalizing deviance do we have in education? Let me tell you a story. When I got to Aurora as superintendent, we had a really bad problem with truancy. In fact, when I went by the high schools we had, I couldn't tell whether the school was in or out because there's so many kids outside. And it became one of those things where people would just kind of, they normalized deviance. It's too hard to do. We got other things to worry about. And the problem was that problem. It really was something that was part of the system. You know, complex systems fail in complex ways, but this was a major piece that was part of that. And so we took it on, developed a 18-faceted truancy program that reduced truancy by over 35%. So another one was, I was mentoring a young man because our leadership team insisted everybody took at least one child as a mentee. And my guy was bringing homework home on copied pieces of paper. And I'd ask him, I said, well, where's your textbook? Oh, well, they didn't give me one. So I thought maybe we were underfunding textbooks. So I went back and went to a high school, and sure enough, being shown around, says, do we have these textbooks? Oh, yeah, we have textbooks. Well, where are they? And I went over in our storage room, and they're all stacked up. And I said, well, why aren't we giving them out to the kids? And he says, well, because if we give it to them, they never return them. I couldn't believe it. It was one of those things where the way to solve the problem was to use the copy machines to copy the textbooks instead of giving the kids and holding them accountable for returning the book. So normalizing deviance can be very, very insidious. It can be, sneak up on you and go from there. I do want to spend just a few minutes talking about history, decision-making, organizational structure, and system effects. So history. NASA was constrained by budgets. Does that sound familiar? Space shuttle program, juggling cost efficiencies, workforce reduction, safety personnel cutbacks. Wow. What history in school districts prevents success? Micromanaging Board of Education's, lack of diversity, inability to adjust, budget cuts. Let's talk about decision making. NASA had a lot of pressure to build the space station. So this mission actually was a science mission, not a space station mission, so it didn't have a lot of priority. And people kind of took their eye off the ball because it wasn't a priority. If you were an astronaut, you would not want to go on a space science mission. You wanted to go to the space station. That was the more, exciting mission to do. So acceptance of phone debris losses, was it a threat to safety of flight? And, the issue of what pressures were on people to make timelines. So in education, failing to listen to the echoes and not having a balance of power and checks and balances is important. Now, Sally Ride was on our board. She just recently passed away, unfortunately. First American woman in space. Not the first woman, but the first American woman in space. She was the only person on the Ford investigation in 1986 for Challenger and in 2003 for Columbia. So we're at a press conference, which we gave every week. And she's sitting next to me, and I just got finished answering a technical question on the engine. And then she was asked by an astute reporter, Sally, you are the only person on this board who has been on Challenger and Columbia. What do you think? And she said something very astute. She said, I hear echoes of Challenger. And in truth to the fact, it was echoes of Challenger, because the organizational culture, which I want to talk about here a little bit, was interesting in NASA. NASA was is such an amazing organization. We could spend days, weeks, and months talking about the amazing accomplishments of NASA. And one of the things that obviously happened was this was not a good day. So she said, I hear echoes of Challenger. So the truth of the matter was that some of the lessons that came out of Challenger were not applied to Columbia. Now, when we start thinking about what the lessons were, let me just tell you this story. The Navy, the U.S. Navy, every nuclear officer in the U.S. Navy studied the case study of Challenger in 1986. So I was curious, and I said, how many senior executives at NASA studied the case study on Challenger? None. Not one. Now you got to remember that in 1986, the leaders in NASA in 2003 were young pups back in 1986. And now they're the leaders. And not one of them had gone to school and studying. So you've got to be able to look back on lessons learned so you can take care of responsibilities and understand what went wrong. So the organizational culture in NASA for a while was just, okay, let's put 1986 behind us. Let's move on. And the clearest evidence of that is they collected the debris in 1987, when they got all the debris back from the Challenger, and they stuck it in a silo at Kennedy Space Center and covered it up and sealed it. It's interesting, the families of Columbia in 2003 said they wanted all of the pieces to be spread out in all laboratories around the world to be able to learn as much as we possibly could from this tragic accident. It was a much more, I think, effective and conducive to learning kind of approach by these amazing families who lost their loved ones during that flight. So, I'd ask you the question on organizational culture. In education, failure to work as a team with data teams, failure to believe every child can learn, lack of accountability metrics that are transparent. What is it that we have within our system, in our organizational culture, that prevents us from getting to the point where we really want to accelerate student achievement and close the achievement gap? System effects, the last one. There was historic policy decisions that created systemic flaws in NASA. They had fiefdoms. Does that sound familiar? They had the NASA's fiefdom at Kennedy Space Center, and the fiefdom at Johnson Space Center, and Marshall Space Center near New Orleans. They had these little fiefdoms that were actually identified as a problem in 1986 that were still a problem in 2003. So in education, what about our fiefdoms? What about our barriers? What about the artificial barriers between elementary school and middle school to high school? And if we really have a P20 focus, preschool to the 20th grade, high school to 12, college to 16, master's and PhD to 20, what is it that we have in our culture that is preventing us from being as effective as we possibly can? In education, what about working with deficits, managed instruction versus empowerment, no child left behind, emphasis on accountability. And as we move into the new No Child Left Behind. So, in conclusion, as we get forward here, I just want to kind of demonstrate to you what it is that really allows us to be able to think of a organization that's a healthy organization. Here's one, and I'll give you a number. Assumptions. Watch your assumptions. You know, NASA thought the space shuttle was getting to be operational like an airliner, and that was a big mistake. They started taking their eye off the ball. In education, do we assume money will solve our problems, or do we need to do a better job with what we have? Assumptions. How about procedures? You know, in NASA, they gave responsibility for cost, schedule, and safety to one person, and that was too much. In education, do we need to have checks and balances with auditors, temperature checks with school visits by leadership team, semi-annual state of the school reports, data fairs at the end of the year? Procedures. How about norms? That's the normalizing of deviance again. In education, what deviance have we normalized? Office referrals, truancy, dropout rates, textbook issues. Norms. How about procedures? Is the integration office in NASA really providing horizontal integration? Was it really doing its job of breaking down the fiefdoms? In education, do we have school fiefdoms, or are we integrated by feeder systems or elementary, middle, high school groupings? Or how do we approach that to make sure that we're crossing those walls, clocks, and calendars to break down those barriers for extended learning opportunities? Procedures. How about standards? You know, standards are an interesting thing. In NASA, they had a standard in a lot of books. Remember I told you that piece of foam was 1.2 pounds, and I said it hit at 100 miles an hour? That was about 500 foot-pounds of pressure. Do you know what the specification in the textbook said that any part of the wing could accept as a hit? 0.006 foot-pounds. 0.006 foot-pounds. That's like if you held a pencil, 6 feet off the ground and dropped it. That's the impact that the wing could take. And it took a 500 foot-pound pressure, not 0.006. In education, do we know what is proficient for fourth grade writing? You know, standards are kind of funny things. If we start making exceptions to standards, if it's written down, it should be followed, okay? And if it's not being followed, take it out or revise it or change it. But if you have something written down and a selected adherence to that rule, then what do you think someone who's young, young teacher comes along and says, well, the older teachers or principals or superintendents, they're not paying attention to that rule. Well, I'm not going to pay attention to this one because I don't think it's a smart one. And that's not conducive to a highly reliable organization. So constant learning is something we do. Study what went wrong before, like NASA didn't do that with Challenger. Checks and balances. You know, in education, do we have means where the youngest employee can provide an input? The youngest teacher feels comfortable raising their hand. Do we have anonymous chat rooms, safe to tell, fraud, waste, and abuse lines? When you're having a highly reliable organization, you have to have redundancy. In education, have you given up on truancy, homework, grouping, social promotion? Another example of a highly reliable organization is how do you handle preoccupation with failure? In education, do we look at a problem and say, this is one more failure or this is one more thing we can fix? Do we own the challenge? All of us? What am I going to do to fix the problem, and what plan can I give a supervisor to help me? Just don't say, okay, what are you going to do for me, boss? Or here's a problem. How about giving them what the problem is, what you're doing to fix the problem within your capability, and then provide some avenues that the superior can take, whether it be the principal, teacher leader, superintendent. Resilience. In education, can we demonstrate resilience in one area but fail in others? Be good in instruction but fail on curriculum. Interesting. Trend analysis. Data. Data does a lot. At NASA, they had too many waivers, no real metrics, lack of sharing lessons learned. In education, do we have data teams, data walls, open climate surveys, the transparency of data for accountability? Integration. I told you, a lot of stovepipes. in NASA? Is your strategic plan truly integrated or a hodgepodge of ideas not solely focused on student achievement? Communication. I'll tell you, I've told this story a number of times where I said to students, I said, if you want to be a billionaire when you grow up, oh yeah, everybody raises their hand. And said, okay, well here's 2 subjects that you can do a dissertation on when you get your doctorate degree, and you'll be a billionaire. You know, one is, what is the role of emails? You know, we all get them, and we're overwhelmed with them, but what is the true impact on how we do? Is it directive or is it just water cooler conversation? The other one is PowerPoint. I'm showing you a PowerPoint here, but I've got a lot of data to back it up. Unfortunately, NASA had a lot of PowerPoints, but you couldn't find the data when we asked for it, because it was George had it, and George has been retired for 3 years. So it's one of those things of being able to hold the data. And then finally, watch and listen for those weak signals. You know, where's the next piece of foam going to come off? You know, having data collection, trend analysis, you know, to point you in the right direction. You know, on failing students, get them before they fail. Or are we reactive and not proactive? Like response to intervention with academic and behavior. Can we get to that point where we actually are helping students before they fail to try to be proactive and not reactive? So ladies and gentlemen, we'll take some questions here, but I just want to end here with just a picture of the crew and a quote from President Bush. This cause of exploration and discovery is not an option we choose. It is a desire written in the human heart. We find the best among us, send them forth in unmapped darkness, and pray they will return. They go in peace for all mankind, and all mankind is in their debt. So that concludes the formal presentation. I'd be glad to take questions as we move along here. So can I get some help from either Catherine or Sarah?
John, that was fascinating, and there are quite a few parallels to what's happening today in education. In the chat box, we've been having some conversations about some of these parallels, some that you pointed out and some that we're finding in our own conversation as well. At this point, I'm going to, since we don't have so many people on the line that it would be difficult to do this, if someone would like to ask John a question, I'm going to ask that you just go ahead and use your microphone to do that, or make a comment. Joe, you've been talking about some of the decision-making that happens in education that was similar to some of the decision-making trails that we saw in this exercise. Do you want to share anything about that?
Well, the one thing that really struck me right out of the gate, John, was the comments you had about the lack of a national vision. And I really believe, and one of the things I found interesting is if you go out and you're working in educational reform, there's over 300 million different ideas how to fix, you know, what they feel is broken. And at some point, I think we have to come together and say, well, there are 300 million ideas. What are the 4 or 5 that we can come together on and work on? And how can we put all of our individual differences away so that we can really propel things forward? And, you know, from standing in the White House like some of the other people on this conversation, we were invited in during our year as Teacher of the Year, to working down to my local building. That's one of the things I find is this sporadic vision that's just here, there, and everywhere, and it seems like they are looking for the magic bullet, and there isn't one. It's just going to take a lot of hard work and, you know, people rolling up their sleeves, and I'm just curious from your perspective, from the high level in the military that you worked on initiatives where you've seen the same thing. How did you work to overcome that in the military, and how are you working on it now to overcome that in the school system?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it really goes to the heart of how you approach this thing. I want you to imagine a mosaic. You know, mosaics of, you know, little pieces that make a picture. You know, you look under a Turkish rug, and it's all a mishmash. But you look on top of it, and you see a beautiful pattern. you know, in a mosaic, you have all these little pieces, and they're all put together. You know, they make a beautiful picture. And I like to visualize, you know, in our strategic plan, kids walking across the stage and getting their diplomas. But some of those pieces are large and some of them are small. But if they're not integrated in a system or systems approach, not a one silver bullet kind of answer, let's put all our eggs in this one basket, you know, then we're going to fail. So I will tell you in a strategic plan, you know, strategy is connecting ends with means. In our case, our end was the vision, to graduate every student with a choice to attend college without remediation. Pretty short and sweet. Graduate every student with a choice to attend college without remediation. But that was the end. The means were the goals and objectives. And we captured our system of systems under 4 buckets. One was people. The second was achievement, because that's the heart of what we do. But you can't get achievement if you don't have people. And C was community, and then E was environment. That's spelled PACE, people, achievement, community, environment. And that allowed people to feed in from the bottom, not top down. Yes, our strategic plan was written. We tried to do as much as we could to get inputs, but it was 14 pages with pictures. It wasn't a 1,000-page document. And it allowed people to fill in from the bottom on how they were going to improve people, achievement, community, and environment. So if you take that approach of a system of systems like a mosaic, some of those pieces and their goals and objectives, you know, connecting ends, the vision, with means, the goals and objectives, allowed us to be able to have an integrated element. So our litmus test was if what we put in the strategic plan did not accelerate student achievement and close the achievement gap, both things had to be both, then we weren't going to do it. And if we did do it and it didn't work, we'd fix it. And if we did it and it didn't work and it really didn't work, we'd get rid of it. So think of that as a mosaic, system of systems, connecting ends with means. And when that kind of approach is taken, I
agree, and I got one more thing to say, and then I'll let somebody else step up. But the other thing that struck me, and I'm going to talk about this when I get back to class tomorrow, is the antiquated technology that sometimes we found and that NASA used in the different systems, you know, from the reel-to-reel tapes to even the computer systems that they used. I know just from my time at Space Camp and the other stuff that I've studied, you know, they weren't using real high-end processors like we'd think they were using, but, you know, it worked. And, you know, for me, we still use a lot of antiquated instructional methodologies or the way we approach just education in general. I'm working with a group of low-level readers and in my ELA class, and a group of those kids, they just struggle to write. And it's interesting enough, I could have kept banging my head up against the wall, but I had a young man come up to me last week, and he said, I want to create a multi-level Minecraft game for you. And I said, you know, and so I sat there and thought about it a little bit, and the wheels kept spinning in my head, and I thought, you know what, a perfect way for this young man to write an award-winning research paper on it. So he has spent countless hours at home researching, hanging out with friends, building this level, but all I asked him to do was integrate all of the stuff he was going to have to write in a term paper anyway. And what would have turned out as a marginal product is turning out as an exemplar piece. And I just think that we have to think creatively in this next generation and with this group of kids as to how we want to approach education. I think there are a million different ways to get to the finish line, but our goal is to get to the finish line and help our kids come in. And sometimes I think we get lost in what direction we're trying to prove. And I'm just wondering from your perspective, as you've seen the military struggle sometimes with adding in maybe new technology. I know we're known for that, but you look, you know, in these reel-to-reel systems, sometimes we don't employ them. How are you trying to deal with this in your school system to make sure that you're getting to the finish line using every tool possible so that your kids can find success?
Well, I think that's, again, another good question in regards to the system of systems. You use the ELA example. Let me just approach that for a minute. Here's how, you know, our thought leadership from our teammates came in from the teacher level all the way up to the superintendent. We came up with a multifaceted approach to English language learning. One, we made it a condition of employment that you be ELA English language learning certified. Okay, and if you came to us and you didn't have it, we passed a mill levy override where we had enough money we could help get you that certification. Second one we have demonstration classrooms for English language learning in every school. Third, we have teacher leaders for English language learning in every school. 4, we adopted a program from California called English Language Association. And the final one is we came out with a kind of a strategy that talked about ELD, extended learning direction and training, where we pull kids out. So if you're an English language learning student in elementary, you got 40 minutes a day, middle school 45, high school 50, every single day. And then we had a kind of approach for all teachers in all subjects to be able to take their learning and be able to apply in the classroom on a normal basis, not just a pull-out. So that was a system of systems approach to be able to get to that specific problem. It wasn't any one thing like, making a condition of employment. It had to be more than that. It had to be built around something. So we considered that a center of excellence for English language learning. So again, no silver bullet, working the approach. I do want to just mention something about comments here. I hope everybody heard what I said about, there's one comment about, here we go, blame the teachers again. It's a system approach. Again, there's no one solution. Even if we had all the best teachers in the world in one school, you still have some challenges with English language learning and so forth and so on. Not excuses, but you still have some challenges there. And the technology might not be there. The facilities may not be good. Maybe the curriculum is not good. I mean, it's a combination of things. There's no single point of failure. So don't hear what I said by blaming any one group or one. It's a system of systems challenge. It's not one person or one. Well, there's no one silver bullet. There's no one person to blame, like I talked about. And then the other one is, there's a comment here about data. I always thought that was interesting. Teachers in the classroom are evaluating kids every single day. Come up to the whiteboard. Get on the smart board. Take this 10-question quiz. Ask them questions. Give them one-on-one. Deal with them in small groups, large groups, individual. We're constantly evaluating. So that's data that's coming in, and our ability to be able to adjust the learning. But it takes an incredible amount of. I just marvel at the way teachers were able to handle it, and the complexity of the classroom. You can have English language learner, free and reduced lunch. You get kids who are in our school district. We had 40% English language learning, 73% poverty, 120 languages spoken in there. There's only 192 countries in the world. And we had a small UN going on there. So it was a real challenge to be able to move all of these dynamos, wonderful, talented kids, but be able to allow them to maximize their potential. And it really was a pleasure to watch when it was done well, and it was done well a lot. And we build on that. But we need to get better. We need to learn from each other. We need to open the door and share. It's not my kids, my classroom, my data. It's our kids, our classroom, our data. We share it, and we learn from each other and be able to get stronger. When you're weak in one area, somebody else is strong, we build on that. If you've got a talent that you can provide, somebody else, provide it. So it's that kind of thing where the teamwork has got to be part of it. And that's something any organization, no matter who you are, in business, military, or in education, we all have to continually work on. Other questions? Let me just show you one thing before we sign off. This is a question I usually get. What if they knew that it was a problem? Could they have fixed it? Here's the answer. They could not have alone. Bottom line is they could have done a spacewalk, because remember, they didn't have an arm. While this looks empty, was a space science module in the back of the shuttle, But they could have looked to see if they had a crack. Now, once they knew there was a crack, what would they have done? Well, the only viable solution, to be honest, was to launch Atlantis, which was on a space pad, and do a rescue mission, and abandon the Columbia to reentry and let it burn up. That is the only real answer. They didn't have the tools to fix it at that time. They did later on after our recommendations, but they didn't at that time. So I know we're coming up on the hour. Catherine or Sarah, is there anything else? I just want to end up on one comment, if you'll allow me, and then I'll get off.
John, you go right ahead.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time. I hope, it's one of those things. Remember I told you we were at Nacogdoches on the second day with debris around us. We held our hands together that day, believe it or not. There was only 7 of us and a 13-member board eventually. And we vowed to hopefully whatever we put together would be lessons learned that could be applied and honor those who died and be able to make sure that their lives were not lost in vain and be able to go there. So just leave you with one thought here. Let me just bring it up here. We have, as was mentioned early on, a organization now that's made up of superintendents of the year. This is the website, and right now this is who we are. We've got superintendents in all these states listed. They're all superintendents of the year. 2 of them are national superintendents, and one is a former assistant secretary of education, as well as being superintendent of the year in California. So if we can help in any way, please don't hesitate to call. That's the website, vistaquest.bz, up here on the top, vistaquest.bz, and we'd be glad to help in any way. I appreciate everybody's attention. Hopefully you'll find this of interest. There's our contact information on the bottom, and be glad to stay in touch with anybody. And I hope our relationship between VistaQuest with Superintendents of the Year can partner with Teachers of the Year to enhance the transformation and enhancement of accelerating student achievement and closing achievement gaps. And I appreciate your attention, and thank you very much for allowing me to present this.
John, thank you so much for taking the time to present this and give us so much to think about. And absolutely, I totally agree with you. We need to find ways in which our 2 organizations can do some good work together. As teachers and superintendents who care deeply about education and about students, we need to find a way to work together so that we can make a difference together. And you and I will continue to look for those ways. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
And we always end every conversation talking about students. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.